Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jose Villegas, and I am the Deputy Director of the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. The County Civil and Human Rights Education Enforcement Agency. Our office investigates complaints of discrimination, coordinate the fight against human trafficking around the region, ensure equitable language access to all county government services, and provide opportunities for learning in the area of social justice. Today, we join with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in celebrating and recognizing the 76th anniversary of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please use the chat feature where you are watching to ask questions, which we will share as time allows. On December 10, 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a landmark in establishment of global human rights. As the United Nations states, the power of the Universal Declaration is the power of idea to change the world. It inspires all. It inspires us to continue working to ensure that all people can gain freedom, equality, and dignity. It is our honor at the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights to be able to support this work. It is my pleasure now to introduce our moderator of today's event, Dr. Mark Winston, the Chief Executive Officer of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. Dr. Mark Winston is an author, columnist, and book reviewer. In January 2024, he was appointed as CEO of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in Largo, Maryland. He has spent most of his career in library management and university faculty positions, including holding positions of librarian, public library director, university library director, assistant chancellor for academic affairs, engagement officer, development officer, and full-time faculty member. He has also served as management and consultant and trainer and diversity consultant and trainer working with range of academic, corporate, and public sector clients. His research and writing focus on various aspects of leadership libraries, access to information, economic inequality, and public policy, have included 3 books and more than 40 author and or co-author research journal articles and book chapters. Welcome, Dr. Winston.
Thank you, Jose. I'm very enthusiastic about today's discussion. I'll begin by saying a little bit about our 2 organizations, that is Prince George's County Memorial Library System and the Office of Human Rights. The mission of the 2 organizations relate directly to providing access to information and opportunities and fostering fairness and equity. So we're particularly interested in this discussion about human rights. We're honored to have such extraordinary guests today for our discussion, and I'll begin with those introductions. Judge Sean Wallace is president of the United Nations Dispute Tribunal. He was elected to the Dispute Tribunal by the UN General Assembly in 2022, with the 190 nations each casting a vote. And he is the first American to have been elected as a full-time judge on the tribunal. His peers elected Judge Wallace president, effective at the beginning of June of this year. Judge Wallace is based in Nairobi, Kenya, at the UN headquarters in Africa. For 21 years, Judge Wallace served on the Maryland Circuit Court. During that time, he held positions of president of the American College of Business Court Judges, president of the Maryland Circuit Judges Association, and chair of the Maryland Judiciary's Complex Litigation Committee. He has also been active in training attorneys and judges throughout the U.S. and internationally. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and especially be back with my hometown, Prince George's County.
Jennifer Lee Dotson is a software developer who facilitates free access to artificial intelligence powered fundraising technology, generating digital revenue for more than 3,000 nonprofit organizations around the world for the organization Fundraise Up. Ms. Dotson currently serves on the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights, Committee on the Status of Women, and the Committee on Refugee and Immigrant Affairs. She has previously led philanthropy teams at the National Kidney Foundation, American Red Cross, Muscular Dystrophy Association, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. She holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Jennifer.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. So amazing to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
Cleveland L. Horton II was appointed the Executive Director of the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights in September of this year, after serving in a variety of other capacities with the Commission for over 15 years, including as Deputy Director for 11 years. A graduate of the Community College of Baltimore County with an associate's degree in business administration, with a specialization in human resources management. Cleveland went on to earn both a bachelor's in business administration and a master's in human resources management from the University of Baltimore. Throughout his career, he has championed the causes of equality and justice, striving to foster a more inclusive and equitable society. Welcome, Cleveland.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. I feel kind of left out. So we got Sean that's in Nairobi. We got Jennifer that's in Hawaii, right? I'm just here from Maryland, right? So,
and I, as your moderator, also speaking to you here from Maryland. So, Dr. Karen Cabell is Professor of History at Bowie State University and is the University System of Maryland Wilson H. Elkins Endowed Professor. Her areas of specialization include slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and women's history. She is the editor or co-editor of a number of collections, and her scholarship has appeared in numerous academic journals. She has been recognized with such awards as the Georgia Board of Regents Excellence in Research Award. Her book, Running from Bondage, Enslaved Women and Their Remarkable Fight for Freedom in Revolutionary America, won the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society Best Book Award, the Letitia Woods Brown Honorable Mention Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and was a finalist for the Pauli Murray Prize for Best Book in African American Intellectual History from the African American Intellectual History Society. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here and to engage with everyone in this conversation.
And we are very pleased to have all of you here. We are set for a tremendous discussion today. One official disclaimer we have to make, and then we begin with our discussion. Officially, the library nor the Office for Human Rights necessarily endorses the points of view expressed today. Each panelist speaks from their own experience and perspectives. To begin, we begin with a question that we'll pose to all of the panelists, if we can. Looking at the fact that we are here to celebrate and recognize the 76th anniversary of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'd like to begin by asking each of the panelists to speak briefly to what human rights and this declaration mean to you. I think we'll begin with Sean, if we can.
All right, well, let me make a similar disclaimer first that I'm speaking only on my own personal behalf and not on behalf of the United Nations or the UN Dispute Tribunal. That said, I think that nobody put it better than the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who said that human rights are rights we simply have because we exist as human beings. They're not granted by any state, and they are inherent to all of us, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. So they are, in fact, universal. They're rights that we all have by virtue of simply being human beings.
Thank you. Jennifer?
What a wonderful question to start us off. For me, it's so deeply personal. A little bit about myself. I am a first generation immigrant. My family is from Vietnam. I'm also a first generation college graduate. I am very much in appreciation of the opportunity to celebrate the anniversary of the Declaration together with everyone, because our family, myself, was afforded basic fundamental human rights. And those rights included equality, freedom, protection in the eyes of the law, even though my family came from very humble beginnings. And because of those basic human rights, our family was able to flourish. And to this day, I am very committed to make sure our voices are heard so that these rights continue to be protected, continue to be talked about, just like we're talking about today, so that every single individual, every single citizen can enjoy those rights the way that I did, the way that my family did, and the way that we all should. So thank you so much for bringing us together today.
Well, we're off to a really good start, no question. Cleveland?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think as I think about and the role that I play here as the executive director of the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, I would say we all, from a staffing standpoint, are reminded daily of really the profound impact that the principles of human rights have on the lives of individuals and the communities really that we serve. At the heart of our work really truly lies the belief that every person, regardless of race, religion, gender, or any other protected class, is entitled to dignity, respect, and equality. And I think that these principles are not just, or should not just merely be aspirational. They should all really be the fundamental fabric of a just society. I think for the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, the Declaration really for us is more than just an historic piece of paper, right? It is truly a living framework that informs and inspires our mission to address discrimination. And that's whether we're dealing with housing discrimination, ensuring fair treatment in employment, or safeguarding access to public accommodations. Our work and our efforts are really rooted in the universal principles that are referenced in the Declaration. And I think the importance of human rights really cannot be overstated. You know, at a time now when we see that hate and division is on a rise in many of our communities throughout our country and throughout our state, the principles of the Declaration really should resonate with all of us with greater urgency. And it should remind us that the fight for equity and justice is not limited to specific groups or nations, but it should be a universal endeavor for all of us. So human rights are not a privilege for just a few. It really is a promise to many. And I think we should make sure that we keep that at the forefront of all the work that we do.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen?
Yes. So certainly as a descendant of Africans brought to the shores of America, the principles embodied in the Declaration of Human Rights really underscore the fact that all people, regardless of nationality, are entitled to equality, are entitled to respect and dignity. And I think the history of human rights abuses in the United States specifically really reflects a complex and often painful legacy that spans centuries. And coming out of the post World War II period, I think the leaders of the United States and of the countries that were engaged in World War II recognized that there needed to be change in the way in which marginalized groups were treated, and all really humans were treated coming out of the World War II period. So, for the United States to recognize that these human rights abuses in this country um, have spanned centuries and have arisen from systemic discrimination, policies, and practices that have marginalized specific groups based on race, gender, ethnicity, class, and other factors, underscores really the work that this country must do and need to do to restore dignity, respect, and equality to all people.
Well, there's no doubt we're off to a really good start. And I'll say to my friends who are behind the scenes, this is going to be a dynamic conversation. So I'm going to shift the order of our questions immediately, given where it appears that we're headed, because we've talked a bit about context, both current and historical, and big picture principles related to the question of human rights. So if we could, specific question for Karen, could you talk a little bit about, as you've introduced the question of of historical context, just say a bit about the ways in which the idea of human rights has changed over the last 76 years?
Right, certainly. So, the history of the United States in particular is marked by significant advancements in liberty and equality, yet it also reveals persistent human rights abuses rooted in systemic discrimination, economic exploitation, and violations of individual freedoms. And we see violations of human rights abuses in the nation's history through slavery and racial oppression, Native American displacement, gender inequality, and modern injustices. And of course, from the colonial period through the Civil War, the enslavement of African Americans constituted one of the most egregious abuses um, in US history. And of course, millions were forcibly taken from Africa, subjected to brutal labor conditions, and denied basic rights. And even after abolition, systemic racism persisted through Jim Crow laws, disfranchisement, and racial violence, and including lynching. And of course, segregation and discrimination continued into the civil rights era, only gradually giving way to the reforms of the 1960s. And of course, in our present era, we see violations in human rights through modern injustices related to systemic issues such as mass incarceration, police violence, and inequities in healthcare, housing, and education. So there's certainly much more work that needs to be done with regard to um, human rights in the United States.
And as we look at the question of context, both national and international, Sean, you've worked in civil and human rights on both of these levels, including the local level. Um, Asking now just a bit about how your understanding or viewpoint on human rights has changed as you've made the transition and had the opportunity to see the issues on a global scale.
Well, I guess a couple of things. My viewpoint has changed with time, just in being exposed. Before I came to the UN, but just by being exposed to more over my lifetime, the issues have expanded beyond. I was born in 1960, so just basic civil rights that were, championed in the 1960s, and then they proceeded to expand, and so my view of that has also grown, just in general. But coming to the United Nations, and in particular living in Kenya, I've become exposed to the greater world of deprivation of rights. In the United States, we have a lot of work to do yet, but we have a lot of benefits. And there are other places in the world that don't have even the most basic rights and benefits that we enjoy in the United States. So it's kind of expanded in seeing exactly how hard it is to get even the most basic of human rights. And Karen, Dr. Cook-Bell has talked about specific topics in the United States that are, again, still challenges. But for the most part in the United States, people enjoy some basic level of human rights that are not enjoyed by people around the world. So it's being exposed to that, whether it's living in a developing country like Kenya, which has, again, many advantages but many disadvantages to its people, or in dealing with the cases that I deal with. And as a judge, you often see people at their worst. So I'm seeing cases where UN employees, for example, staff members have deprived people who are desperately in need, refugees and other people, who have deprived them of their basic human rights. So it's kind of expanded in two ways. One is just with the passage of time and being exposed to war in the United States, and then being exposed to a much greater spectrum of the needs and the deprivations that people face around the world.
I think as we're beginning, I think we thank our panelists in advance for the fact that their professional perspectives are broad, and we are again attempting to sort of set our framework as we begin our discussion, looking at this question of context. Also, in looking at the question of Maryland, which, given our discussions of things historical and things international, Maryland could be seen as a place with no or few human rights issues. Cleveland, from your perspective, having worked with the state for such an extensive period of time, knowing that things are far more complicated than they seem, can you say a bit about what Maryland's strengths and weaknesses are as they pertain to human rights?
That's a great question, and a tricky one, because my boss, the governor, may be watching. But
we hope your boss, the governor, is watching.
I'll say this: I think that Maryland, has always been kind of considered the northernmost southern state, right? And I think that when you think about Maryland, we've always been seen as, for the most part, more of a progressive state, and I think that ideology has helped and hurt us at the same time. I think for many states and many individuals, when you live in a community that you think is more progressive, you tend to think that the battle or the fight for human and civil rights is won, right? And that some of the opportunities that we are able to engage in a more progressive state, that many of individuals are still not able to do so. I think that we have the privilege and the honor to work in the state where the mantra of the Moore Miller administration is to truly leave no one behind, and they have truly put actions behind doing that. I think that when we think about the strengths of Maryland, I think it is just the overall, and I say overall because not everyone is progressive, but the overall tenure of Maryland is to be more of a progressive state. And that strength allows us to be on the forefront of most human and civil rights issues. But I think on the flip side, when we think about the issues and the opportunities, it goes back to what I just mentioned, that at times we feel like we have won the battle for civil and human rights, and we take our foot off the gas. Whether it's taking a look at how minorities are treated within our educational systems, and that be private and public systems, and how we are addressing those issues. Whether it's the fact that we still have a gender pay gap between how women are paid for equal pay for completing the same work as men. When we think about housing opportunities, we know that within Maryland, we have significantly different communities, right? So if you live on the Eastern Shore, your life and the way you're treated is a lot different than if you live in the Baltimore area. And really trying to figure out how do we become more consistent. I think that one of the things that we always talk about is that civil rights in itself is an evolving topic, right? The issues of civil rights in 2024 are not necessarily the exact same as what they were during the 1960s. As we take a look at this new AI platform and how we're going to be able to handle that and how that's also going to impact human and civil rights, I think that is going to be very significant, because I do see AI as being the next frontier in reference to how civil and human rights are impacted as we continue to move forward. I think that when we take about the leadership, right, because I think the fight for civil and human rights really does start with leadership. When we take a look at the leadership in Maryland is truly poised to be an example of how you continue to move a state forward. And I think that the Moore Miller administration has truly done that. But I think it's a collective effort, right? It's educating the community. It's individuals truly understanding what is humanity, right? So when we talk about human rights, I think everybody has to kind of level set humanity, because as we think about, I think Karen did a great job in talking about just the history from just a nation standpoint. But everybody hasn't really been treated with the level of humanity throughout history, right? So it's easy for us to talk about humanity, but we also must identify and acknowledge the fact that many folks within our communities have not felt or treated as human within our communities, and we must first acknowledge that to be able to address that.
Thank you. I think clearly our conversation must head immediately in the direction of artificial intelligence. And I'm sure this is a real opportunity for us to look at some of these questions. So, Jennifer, certainly your work with artificial intelligence, and we know that there's a lot of fear and distrust, and I would also say some overestimates about what artificial intelligence is and can do. And this is an issue that we in the library world are very interested in when we look at questions of access to information. So, in the context of human rights, can you speak about some of the ways, and I think this is obviously in the context of everything we've been discussing so far and your work on the commission, but the ways that artificial intelligence may be benefiting human rights efforts on the national level and even just in general.
Well, you are not holding back on these hard-hitting questions, my friend. But let me first begin by saying I do appreciate the original question you posed to Karen and grounding us in the history and the historical context of human rights. And fast forwarding to Cleveland, I feel like I went through a roller coaster of emotions just listening to his description on all the points that each of our panelists have shared so far. Can I begin first by saying, listening to the historical context by Karen reminded me that we have come far, but yet we still have so much to do, like she mentioned. In my life, personally, I know that human rights has not been that far away. Sometimes we think, oh, we're celebrating 76 years. Gosh, that's so long ago. It hasn't been. For my parents, being immigrants, they experienced, before I was born, just this confusing world of arriving to the United States and not being treated with the knowledge that what are Asians. They didn't fit the right checkbox even so recently, right? So recently as our Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so they didn't know what line to stand in for applying for housing, which was one of the most basic rights that could be afforded to them as new arrivals to the United States. Now, then also my mother, in struggling to work 3 jobs to support our family. She endeavored to join the healthcare system and work her way up into leadership, but she experienced very, very dramatic gender inequality, sort of how Cleveland had explained. It, we're still struggling with the gender pay gap. My mother, being a female, wanting a better job to earn more money for her family, was discriminated against. And then myself, as I started my family, I remember very distinctly in the workplace when I was interviewing for a position, for a job, and I was very visibly pregnant, 8 months pregnant, to actually say that it's so vivid in my mind, remembering how nervous I felt showing up to a job interview and being fearful that I would be discriminated against with this giant belly in front of me at a job interview. No one should feel that fear, but yet this is something that even after I gave birth in the workplace, finding a place to pump breast milk for my newly born daughter, I hid in the bathroom. Not the most ideal place for a young mother to, again, take care of the basic right and the basic need for her infant to have food, breast milk from her mother and my infant. It's not that long ago that we've been struggling with all of these challenges. Now, fast forward to the question that you just asked about AI. Boy, does our spectrum of topics span the most wild different topics. I think if you asked me just even last year or 2 years ago, Jennifer, would we be discussing AI at a human rights event? I would have said, you're crazy. Why would we be talking about artificial intelligence? But here we are. And in the nonprofit sector, I will say that this has been an incredible, robust discussion because many of us in the nonprofit sector, we are touching the most basic human rights, helping people to be clothed and housed and fed. And we are seeing that our jobs can be helped. Our work, our mission, our organizations can benefit from artificial intelligence in so many ways, saving us time, saving us energy when we are, for example, inputting data into a database, because artificial intelligence can gather vast amounts of data and organize them very quickly. Something that would have taken maybe a human being many hours, many working days to complete this task. So the questions in terms of artificial intelligence, it's actually taking us in the direction of how are we treating that data? How are we ethically handling that data? How are we, for example, making sure that the data prompts that we use in the nonprofit sector are with a lens of equity, with a lens of equality, with a lens that does not have bias. And this is very difficult for us because we are humans, simply because we are humans. And so the manipulation of data in artificial intelligence and the ethics of handling that data in terms of artificial intelligence is incredibly important and will be absolutely an important topic for us to speak about. And so here we are on December 9th, 2024. Mark our words. This is absolutely the time in which we need to dig into artificial intelligence and its effect and its impact on human rights. So thank you for bringing it up. I really, I mean, I am very excited, but I'm also, I invite people who are doing this work like I am every day to gather and have these conversations. And we actually have a monthly group that speaks about exactly this topic. And if there's any interest, please contact me. We're actually meeting again this Wednesday. So every month, the second Wednesday, this group gathers and talks specifically about data and the impact of artificial intelligence in the nonprofit sector. So I look forward to continuing the conversation even beyond today.
Given this question of the dynamic nature of human rights, I mean, certainly artificial intelligence, again, I don't think society was talking much about artificial intelligence 2 or 3 years ago, and now it's being discussed in many places, including in relation to human rights. So, to talk a little bit about this dynamic nature of the issue of human rights, and I'll use just sort of one bit of data that sort of resonates with me as I think about where we are, which looks at the historical and the current. The US used to be, years ago, a country where upward mobility was really central. I mean, I think, Jennifer, when you mentioned in relation to your family, when we talk about Maryland and certainly nationally and internationally, the US was a model for upward mobility. The data does not show that anymore. If a person's born poor, they're likely to remain poor, for example. So, to sort of talk about where we are in terms of this question of context, but also the sort of tension in terms of how the terminology human rights is negotiated, renegotiated nationally and internationally. And we see things such as protections, such as a children's bill of rights, a prisoner's bill of rights, and so on. Depending on sort of the temperature in the country or the larger context. So I've opened the question to the entire panel to say a little bit about the sort of ongoing tension, but also those of you who are experts who work in the field about how we sort of navigate this societally so that the concept of human rights really remains central. Jumping in, should I invite someone, or shall we allow the panel to?
Well, I'll just comment very briefly. I wanted to specifically, I guess, clarify some comments that pertain to U.S. history. I certainly do believe that the U.S. has made significant strides in advancing human rights, but its history underscores the need for ongoing vigilance and reform, and certainly acknowledging and addressing past and present abuses is really essential for building a society that honors the principles of equality and justice for all. And certainly, the United States was founded on these principles of freedom and equality. So I think the United States really has a mission to ensure that all of its citizens are treated with fairness, with equality, and certainly with equal justice under the law. And we haven't, of course, seen that in the history of the United States. So I just wanted to ensure that, I certainly do appreciate the advances that the United States has made, but there is much more work that needs to be done.
I also echo Karen's concerns. As I alluded to, and as it relates to your question about artificial intelligence, Mark, when Karen mentions the history and our troubled history in the United States when it comes to human rights, AI has very inherent risks in perpetuating this discrimination, perpetuating this flawed system that we must be vigilant. And that's exactly the word that Karen used. We must be vigilant. And so we are in a position now, and with this conversation today, highlighting how artificial intelligence really can unfortunately use algorithms that's trained on biased data. And that biased data can perpetuate discriminatory practices in so many areas, And Cleveland, you mentioned many of these areas: housing, right? Hiring, criminal justice was mentioned as well, mass incarceration. It's very risky, and we must work together to make sure that we are moving forward and not perpetuating biased data when it comes to artificial intelligence and human rights. So I will say that and pass it on to.
I just wanted to add on as well to Karen's comments, which I thought were very on point. I think I want to go back to something I mentioned. I think on the first question, when we talked about the fact that human rights is not just a privilege for a few. I think and recognizing the history of our country is that human rights has only been applied to a certain population within our country. So I think when we talk about how do we move forward, or the importance of, or the action steps that we need to take when it pertains to human and civil rights, I think it has to move beyond just these conversations that we have, right? I think that many folks are looking for our country to actually live out the fact that human rights are for everyone here, whether we're talking about in housing, where we're talking about the fact that minority houses are underappraised by anywhere between $20,000 to $40,000. Whether it's the employment gap between whites and minorities as it pertains to employment, there are just a whole host of areas that we haven't improved in as a country. If we want to talk about the home ownership gap, which is greater now than when it was before the Fair Housing Act. I think that there are just a whole host of issues that I think, one, we need to recognize and really just simply move beyond the conversations, because we have a lot of intelligent conversations around human and civil rights. But the question I ask is, when do we move beyond the conversation? When do we see some of these actions being implemented? Whether it's the mass incarceration, where we still see that the fact that blacks in this country have and continue to be the minority, but are the majority when it pertains to our arrest records and the number of individuals that we see within the prison systems. So I think that it is beyond just continuing to have great conversations and standing ovations when people make great comments at these conversations around civil rights. It really is putting things to action. It really is showing folks that they mean that they are human. So when we talk about, I hear a lot of folks talking about getting back to humanity. But when I think about the history of this country, folks have used religion, folks have used the law to treat people inhumanely. And those are the things that we need to address as we think about how we continue to move forward. Because if we don't, then it just continues to be conversations, right? It just there's just another conversation. We're going to celebrate, I think, what is it, tomorrow, the 76th anniversary of the Declaration. But we still find ourselves in situations where we know as a country, if we're being honest, that we shouldn't be in, that are unacceptable to most of us. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why? The fact that this country in itself, and I don't want to make this a political conversation, but the fact that this country still has been unable to elect a woman as the president of the United States says a lot for who we are as a country. So when we really truly think about human rights and how we move forward and how we want to move forward, we have to honestly ask ourselves, are we willing to do the work to move forward? Because it is work. While we have made progress, there's still a lot of work for us to do, but we have to be willing to do the work. When we think about the fact that many organizations are now removing their DEI initiatives that at once were top priority, we now see the rolling back of these initiatives. But again, if we're talking about human rights and the fact that DEI is about doing the right thing, not about profit, it shouldn't be about anything else other than doing the right thing and making sure that everyone is included in the organization. And the fact that we do see many organizations rolling that back, again, I say we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to do the hard work?
I think you're right, Cleveland. The thing, I mean, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand what my original comments were. Living around the world from the United States, I see that the United States still is the beacon for rights in the world. That being said, we know ourselves how much more work we have to do in that regard. I was reminded this was in 1998. I was in South Africa, which was 4 years after they had elected Nelson Mandela as president. It was the first time they had universal suffrage, that Black people had been able to vote. And I was in a museum in Cape Town, and the docent was this elderly gentleman who so proudly told me about how he had been able to vote for the first time. I still get choked up thinking about it. How he was able to vote for the very first time 4 years ago. And he was probably in his 60s when he cast that vote, the first time he was allowed to. And he thought that they were entering a new era of rights, just like he said, just like you in the United States. And I didn't want to dash his hopes, but I knew, my first thought is, and we did this 30 years ago, maybe, and we still have so much more work to be done. And I think that's the important lesson, that you can never say we're there. We've achieved, we've reached the pinnacle, and then just rest on our laurels as we passed a civil rights law, or we've done this, or we've done that. Yet, but there's always things, new challenges, ongoing challenges that need to be addressed, need to be faced, recognized, and then addressed. And I think that is indeed the big challenge, to recognize that even though we've come as far as we've come, we still have yet a long way to go in protecting the rights of everybody, but in the discussion that we're having here, the rights in the United States of everybody in the United States.
Well, and panelists, I'll ask this. Given what we're discussing about being specific, about being clear, and as Cleveland suggests, more than eloquent rhetoric, right? Can we say a bit about how we would define success, right? If we really are, because I think this question of progress clearly has been a through line through our conversation. But I think you all have said that there has been tremendous progress and not nearly enough. And there is a lot clearly that needs to be done. So I think sort of talking about what that looks like, because I know from an organizational perspective, we ask the question, think about to what extent our social justice efforts are successful, right? And how we define it so we can effectively measure as well.
I would say for me, I think it's simple. I think success is when I look at it the same way as we think about our organizations, right? And how do you know that your organization is being successful around inclusion? It's when everyone who's a part of that organization feels included, right? And feels like they're a part of the team, the larger community. So I think for us, when we think about what success as it pertains to human and civil rights, I think it's when everybody feels included, when everybody feels that they have an equal shot. We always talk about the American dream is that you can come here and be whatever you want to be, right? The sky's the limit. But right now, that does not apply to everybody. And I think success is when that truly applies to everyone, regardless of what your race is, what your color is, what your religion is, what your sexual orientation or gender is, right? Whether you have a disability. I think that is success, when regardless of who you are, you have just as much as an opportunity as anyone else. I think for me, that's the success part. And I think, yes, we've made progress, and I just wanted to, whether it's considered tremendous progress or not, I definitely will say I think we've made progress, right? I think I'm not on the tremendous train yet, but I will definitely say that we've made some progress. But I think for me, I think, again, just really taking a look at success is that when you can ask all the different groups that we have here within our different communities, do they feel like a value part of the larger community? And when those answers are resounding yes, that's when you have success. I think right now you still have resounding no's in most minority communities, and I think that's the issue that we have to address.
Yes,
Mark.
I echo everything that has been said, and certainly, um, Frederick Douglass stated that power concedes nothing without a demand, and I think the history of progress in this country has been various marginalized groups demanding their human and civil rights. So they've been instrumental in, for example, ensuring that legislative reforms have been enacted, um, judicial decisions have been passed to ensure the rights of marginalized groups. And of course, social movements have been crucial in advancing human rights. But again, advocacy is essential and it remains really necessary to address ongoing challenges related to human rights.
Mark, I think you asked a wonderful question, and I spend all day of my work immersed in data. And so measuring success and numbers and analyzing SMART goals is music to my ears. And so when you ask that question, I got very excited now. Oh, yes. But I will agree with Cleveland. I'm not on the tremendous train yet either. One of the things that has been mentioned is the gender pay gap. And as a female, as a person of color, I am dismayed with the way that we are not achieving success in that area. And as a mother of a daughter who just got her first job starting January 2025, I was also very disappointed to see that she is not getting paid what she deserves as a young woman in the workforce. So a lot of these things are glaring in my eyes when we do look at measuring success. And another mention, something that sort of really perked my ears up in terms of how are we measuring the rollback of DEI policies and organizations. Cleveland, you mentioned that too. And I want to know, I think we should shout these numbers from the mountaintops because that is not acceptable. That is not acceptable for organizations to be rolling back DEIA policies. Why would we be doing that in the face of how much we need to still accomplish? And so many ways to measure success, but also really shining a light, unfortunately, on the larger and larger gaps that we have here in the United States. So we need to, again, continue having these conversations. But like Cleveland said, how are we each leaving this conversation today committed to making sure we're doing the actions that are needed to ensure that we are not taking 10 steps backwards? So that's a challenge that I think we should all have going forward.
Sean, would you like to speak to this question?
Sure. I think you're right. The tremendous train may have been my word. It was. I didn't mean to say that we're anywhere close to being where we should be. So I guess I'm not on the tremendous train either. However, even if we had what we've accomplished, is always under challenge. Before I left the United States to come to Kenya, I was at a symposium where a U.S. Supreme Court justice, who are supposed to be, committed to approving or protecting civil rights, constitutional rights, said, well, let's just remember, and this is an advocate of original intent, originalism, looking at what the founders meant when they wrote it. He said, and remember that the Constitution was written by white male property owners. So if that's the standard that the Supreme Court is going to be applying to constitutional rights, they're under threat from the highest level. So it's not as far as we've come, and we haven't reached the pinnacle, but also that we can maintain how far that we've come and not have that degrade over time. And there's a constant challenge, because there are people that view the world as zero sum. And every right that's given to somebody else takes something away from me. And as long as people have that perspective, there will be people who will be challenging the exercise or the protection of rights of others because they view it as challenging where they come from. And I say that as I'm looking at this panel, I've, as a white male myself, middle class, I've had many, many advantages that many others have not. And it took me a long time to finally recognize that. I was like, well, I wasn't rich, I wasn't this. Yeah, but I did have some advantages. And I recognized that. And many people that look like me, that grew up like me, they don't recognize that. And in fact, that kind of talk they view as a challenge.
Time is our enemy in this conversation. I assure you, I certainly hope this is the first of a number of subsequent conversations. I want to thank the panelists. Before we conclude, I will introduce my colleague Audrey Lau, who will make a few closing remarks. The word tremendous does apply when we talk about the richness of this conversation. You're still muted, Audrey.
I'm Audrey Lau. I'm the Adult and Senior Services Specialist here at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. It's been an honor to be backstage. I have so many questions that I haven't even asked and haven't had the time to ask. On behalf of the library, I want to express my gratitude for this event and to the Office of Human Rights for partnering with us. In addition to Mr. Villegas, who you met earlier, I want to acknowledge Tiana Davis and Kyla Hannington from the Office of Human Rights, who worked behind the scenes in bringing this event to you today. We know that we have just scratched the surface on this conversation of human rights, and please stay tuned to programming from our two agencies, as this is a conversation that we would like to continue. I want to thank each of our panelists today. Thank you for the time that you've spent with us, and moreover, for the work that you do. You have given us all a lot to think about as we reflect on the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ways it continues to impact and give shape to our world 76 years later. Judge Wallace, Executive Director Horton, Ms. Lee Dotson, and Dr. Cook-Bell, thank you again for being with us today. We hope you have a lovely afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.